Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Professor Hamamoto. It is November 19th, year 2023. The time is 4 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. I hope you're doing all wonderfully well. Today, as you saw by the blurb, we're going to be dealing with Lolita. Now, don't turn off, right? I wouldn't be doing this talk unless I had original insights to share with you today. I haven't published these in any spot. I've been, just to give you a little bit of background before I launch into the talk itself. I've been looking at Nabokov, and don't try to correct my pronunciation. There's some question on whether it's Nabokov or Nabokov, and so on and so forth. But so I'll just refer to him as Nabokov, Vladimir, right? And I've been reading his work. I guess I tried Lolita, I tried it out. I attempted it when I was a teenager, like everybody else. And I didn't learn to appreciate it because I didn't understand it really until I became an adult. And only now, in my later stage, have and it's not because of my age, it's because of the wealth of independent scholarship and mainstream scholarship that has come out in the intervening years between the time I was a prepubescent or an adolescent trying to figure out what this sexuality was all about, right? And I went on through my adult life, beginning with graduate school, studying, well, informally, I studied sexuality. I wanted to study money. I want to study sex. I want to study music. These are, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I succeeded in studying all of them and more in my professional life. So the point is that I'm not a newbie to Nabokov, and perhaps a lot of you are not either. But it's been a long while since I came around to confronting him again. Now I try to remember what it was like reading him back in the my teenage years or preteen years, and I do remember feeling somewhat disturbed by it. Part of it was intellectual confusion because he was writing in a literary style. I knew that much, right? Because I had grew up reading comic books and Mad Magazine, and I'm a child of television and movies. But I could see that this is a self-conscious literature that I was dealing with. That is Professor Vladimir Nabokov. And I notice I call him Professor Vladimir Nabokov because the academic connection is not often, if at all, really discussed in the volumes of books that have been written about Nabokov, either dealing with his work as an aesthetic construct or the sociology of Lolita, the popular culture. And this is by way of insinuating my own discovery about Nabokov, and without really delaying the suspense, because this is one of the features of true crime and crime fiction. And by the way, I came into this world reading true crime. I hated crime fiction, except for the obvious choices, right? James M. Cain and Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and some other people, John D. MacDonald, um, more recently, Patricia Highsmith, all the canonical, so forth, so-called writers I know about. But as a genre itself, I wasn't interested in crime fiction as much as I was interested in true crime. What's the distinction? True crime are allegedly, and I say allegedly because some books take liberties with the facts and are highly interpretive, which is okay as long as we are forewarned that that's going to be the approach. Norman Mailer comes to mind when I think about the sort of hybrid form, part journalism, part true crime, part literature. right? The executioner's song, he gets into the head or tries to of Gary Gilmore, Truman Capote, another person. These are people, by the way, are incredibly influential in my own work, my own writing, my own understanding of the world. And they were grouped under new journalism. This Hunter S. Thompson was also part of that milieu, even though they might not have stylistically or politically had much to share in common. They all kind of emerged at the same time. So the point is, I've been looking at true crime for a long while, and it always kind of nagged me what Nabokov was all about, right? Because he's been coy, and his wife Vera, his wife, editor, intercessor, protector, driver, she was everything, right? They created a mythology around themselves. And it's not just noted by me, but even the biographers, of which he has more than a few, note, not because they're copying out, but they note the difficulty they encountered in trying to find out who the real Nabokov was, right? And it might be an exercise in futility to find out what's real about any person, Nabokov notwithstanding. However, or Nabokov included. However, I would hazard to, this is more than a guess. This is more than, I would call it a hypothesis. This is more than just speculation. But I will, right up front, tell you what I have concluded up to now as of November 19th, 2023. And this hypothesis that I'm going to lay out might help inform future biographers or students of Nabokov, both literal students and people who've been influenced, and people, writers, for example, novelists, and there are legions of them for whom Lolita was a seminal influence on their aesthetic and their politics and their approach to literature. Now, Nabokov felt that, or at least publicly, he stated that don't try to psychoanalyze. He was anti-Freudian, which I agree with. He did not want you to psychoanalyze it. He did not want you to look into real life scenarios as the basis of a book like Lolita. And I'm going to strictly speak of Lolita today, because he started out as a poet, and he wrote some couple of different versions of his autobiography. He was a very slippery guy. And a couple of other novels, Pale Fire, for example, and some other ones that I found probably more impenetrable than Lolita. At least Lolita has a body of work that you can read, and everybody has an opinion on it. So I hope you will leave your mind open to some of these suggestions that I offer today. And I will at the outset state that I was once again reinvigorated by going back to Nabokov by a book that's fairly new. It's been out a few years. What is it? 2019. It's the author is Sarah Weinman. She's a brilliant writer. She's a critic, and I don't think she's tried her hand at fiction, but she's an excellent journalist, an excellent researcher. This is the type of writer that should be teaching in academia rather than most of the hacks that are in the English department or literature, comparative literature, or women's so-called women's studies. She can wipe the floor with them because of her insights, and she does her homework. She's read the academic books. I mean, it's probably all of them on Nabokov. She's done her homework in specific, in addition to doing this daily grind of keeping up with this huge body of not primarily nonfiction, but also she's shown herself, as I've seen her on YouTube giving talks, shown her to be very well versed in the history of true crime, crime fiction, especially where it concerns women. And and I will say it's added to my appreciation of certain writers that the first time around were not really given the respect and recognition. And she mentioned one that I'm beginning to, I sat for 2 hours reading this rapidly. If you can't see, it's called In the Lonely Place, Dorothy B. Hughes. Now I'm going to have to read. I think she wrote a total of 16 novels, and I got already through a quarter of it. She's an excellent prose stylist and has a really good insight to human psychology, from what I can tell. And that's what I like about crime fiction. I'm warming up to it finally after years and years of reading true crime, all the sensational ones. You know the books, Ted Bundy, and of course, there's the sexy Nazis, and there's all these different subgenres within it. And didn't really appreciate true crime, even though crime fiction, even though Hollywood itself, and certainly German cinema, but definitely and French and Japanese really adopted the policier, or the French call it film noir, and it made its way into the Hollywood canon. This is Humphrey Bogart, of course. This is a cinema adaptation of In a Lonely Place. And, I'm not expecting it to be a one-to-one analog of the novel. There's, when people say, oh yeah, the movie was nothing like the book. Of course not. They're two different media, right? So you got to look at all of them if you want to gain some insight into this work. And it's directed by Nicholas Ray, who is interesting in himself. Because we're talking about Lolita. He was he was a film director, of course, and belatedly given recognition primarily by foreign critics, and Americans decided, he's okay. He's up there, Nicholas Ray. But he was what would be called a guy that was minor attracted adult, right? In Rebel Without a Cause, right? James Dean, Sal Mineo, and of course Natalie Wood. He directed that, and he was dating Natalie Wood. I think she was a teenager. He was in his 40s or something. So it was not what you would call, quote unquote, age appropriate. And that it was a recurrent theme in the life and in the literature, even in the poetry of Vladimir Nabokov, right? And this is what Weinman herself argues. He revisited that theme of older man and a girl. He called them nymphets. That's not my term, okay? So don't blame me. That's Nabokov. I don't know if he coined it or it's a neologism, but he put that into circulation. He's a master of language, right? And a good literary artist, this is one definition that I come up with, is someone who alters the language too, right? In some fashion. But this book is, and I encourage you to pick it up, read it. And I've read it several times already. Just going back and also cover to cover. It's called The Real Lolita, subtitle A Lost Girl, An Unthinkable Crime, and a Scandalous Masterpiece. Yes, she and other critics give Nabokov a pass so far as his moral and ethical stature is concerned. She argues, and it's not in the book explicitly, but in talks, I've seen interviews that she's given that are available on YouTube. I'm not going to recap them for you. You can go look at it. She's very articulate too. She has a really good understanding of not only her work. I mean, she's a critic, but other people's work. So I encourage you to tune into her. In fact, I'm just picked up an anthology that she edited, Evidence of Things Unseen, True Crime in an Era of Reckoning. So we're in an era of reckoning. Maybe that's why there's such huge fascination with the true crime genre. We see that in Netflix. We have all these multi-part series on Ted Kaczynski or Jeffrey Dahmer, on and on. I'm kind of sick of it, to tell you the truth. And that's why I kind of let this book languish on my shelf for several months before getting into tackling, because it's Lolita. Like you, I probably thought I knew all I ever wanted to know about Lolita, but that's not the case. It helped, this book here by Weinman help stimulate some patterns that I see recur in Nabokov's life, right? And outside his life. And I'm talking about the American 50s and going into the 1960s, the post-war period after World War II, because that's when he really comes into his own. I think that's important to understand the post-war period after World War II, because that's the period of time where he became Professor Vladimir Nabokov, and he became a professor of literature. His specialty was he's Russian by nationality, even though I think French was his first language. He comes from a fairly elite, I think, diplomatic family out of St. Petersburg, but I can't remember. He's multilingual, of course, but he adopted English as his primary literary language. But I mention this is because he's an outsider to Americana of the 1950s, right? We Americans, and I'm third generation American, tend to romanticize it, the 50s, because of the music, the popular culture, the innocence, and the nuclear family, which was subsequently put through the ringer through the 60s and 70s, right? That whole idealized vision of America, if it ever existed. And from reading Nabokov and some of the true crime books that harken back to the 50s, it wasn't as idyllic as we might imagine or we would like to think, right? And we don't need to be reminded of that, though. There's tons of literature now, right? Fine literature, literary novels, as well as true crime and more salacious dreck, as they say in Yiddish, where we can form our own opinion of the 1950s that certainly does not square with what I grew up with as a child of the baby boom generation. And I'll tell you, so where I am today, I didn't finish my thought, because for those of you who don't want to hear the evidence that I'm about to put forth, and I don't know if it's hard evidence. I don't know if we need hard evidence at this point. This enterprise, it depends upon speculation and hypothesis before we start looking at the evidence. And maybe future scholars, researchers, journalists will now, after they've heard my hypothesis and hypotheses, will look for the evidence, and they're going to say, oh, it was hidden in plain sight all this time, and why didn't we see it? But my argument, ladies and gentlemen, my hypothesis, I won't call it a theory, I'll call it a speculative exercise, but my speculation, and speculation is about looking into it, right? My hypothesis, let's call it, is that Vladimir Nabokov, Professor Nabokov, whether he knew it or not, and I think he did know it, that's a guess, that's speculation. Vladimir Nabokov should be understood as an American intelligence asset, and he might have even been a double or triple asset, given his multiple language skills. He lived in Berlin for many, many years, along with his wife there. They left Berlin, the couple, Nabokovs, because Vera was Jewish, and this was, you don't want to be in Paris or Berlin. They moved to Paris. You don't want to be in Germany when Hitler's rising to power, right? And then they escaped to not escape. He left. He's cosmopolitan. He can go anywhere. He had money. His family had money, so they went to Paris. And of course, there was German-occupied France during World War II, and eventually they made their way to the United States. Now, this is an area that we need to flesh out or provide details. How did he get here? Who were the people that sponsored him? What was the process of him making that transnational leap from Europe, let's call it, because he went from multiple countries, Western Europe into the United States, which he adopted as home. By the way, this, even though he was thankful and glorified the great American scenic highway, and the roads loom large in Lolita, as we will see in a moment, and they were part of his intellectual as well as professional landscape. And I think there are reasons for that. The road, the interstate highway in particular, which itself was a creature of Eisenhower's, the post-war desire to connect the United States of America with this great grid of highways, not for automobile pleasure, right? That was kind of secondary. The primary was for national defense, where they can move tanks and material cross country in case of invasion, attack, whatever. I think that's what the way it was sold to the U.S. Congress. For the American people, we were sold on it because, well, you'll see the USA in a Chevrolet, according to Dan Shore, and or you go in on the Pontiac with the Nabokovs and the drive, and that's kind of the structuring metaphor and reality of Lolita, this cross country treks that he in real life, IRL in real life, that he did with Vera, sometimes graduate students, sometimes his son once he got old enough drove. I don't think Nabokov himself drove. He'd sit in the back seat making notes and reading teen magazines and absorbing the American popular culture, which the references are spread throughout the book Lolita, and that's one of the literary flourishes, touches that elevates it from sheer smut, right? Smut meaning dirt, another Yiddish word for you, schmutz, or we might call it pornography. And the reason why that is important, because when it was published first, it was published twice, two major times. It's been reissued, of course, in many different editions, but the two major ones, one was it came out as a pornography. That's how it was read, even though Nabokov didn't intend it to be, I don't think. Either that or he's being coy or disingenuous with us. And the second time it was published as literature by G.P. Putnam, right? But in either case, it was a tweaking of this middle class Americana, this bourgeois, petty bourgeois existence, right? That's kind of what the jollies, I guess, that people who read erotica and all these taboos, cultural taboos that weren't being talked about in the 50s when the first edition of Lolita, which was not permitted in the US, it was published, I think, in France first, and then people started smuggling it in, right? Just like Tropic of Cancer, Henry Miller, another literary masterpiece, which was first seen as smut. It had to go through the U.S. Supreme Court. I don't have to go through the backstory, or otherwise we're going to be here for hours and hours. And that's another reason why Lolita, by the way, is so cherished by the intelligentsia. But at the same time, people like me as a teenager and people with no understanding of Nabokov and his background and what he represents at all will buy the book anyway because they're looking for the dirty parts, the salacious content. So he got it both ways. A really fascinating way that he managed to negotiate it. But again, what irritated me, even as a teenager reading this material and going back to it over and over again, I was put off, to put it mildly, by his deceit. You can tell that he's pulling our leg. He's having one on us. He's not being truthful. And to me, if you are an artist, an intellectual, that is your stock and trade, the truth. That doesn't mean you have to spill your guts about who you slept with, the other day or whoever else. That's relatively incidental, but we have to know who you are, right? We have to understand, well, maybe I'm being Platonic or essentialist, as they used to say, who will ever know, right? But these games, that's what I didn't like. He's playing all these little literary games, right? You read someone like Charles Bukowski, and he self-consciously said, I'm not going to write literary fiction. Like, I'm just going to write my, and that's probably the reason why he's so popular among certain. There are writers like that. They really don't, they eschew the flourishes that so-called literary writing indulges themselves in. And he does that. Maybe it's a parody of literature, because he was a professor of literature, right, at Cornell, and did guest visiting professorships at places like Stanford. And I think he's been on panels, University of Utah, I found recently, where he met Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel. Dr. Seuss was not a doctor, and he was not a Seuss. He was a Theodore Geisel, who was an OSS, by the way. And I mentioned the OSS, that's the predecessor to the CIA. Most of you know this, so I'm not going to go into it. And he went into children's books. You know Cat in the Hat, right? That's Dr. Seuss. Most of you do. In order to constrain the language of the American child under the guise of teaching them how to read. So I grew up with Dr. Seuss. And by the way, I'm not going to give the names of the people I was with, but went to go see his house in La Jolla, which is in San Diego area, right? Huge military complex. He comes out of the military. He's OSS. He's an intelligence asset, just like I'm saying Nabokov was an intelligence asset, either with foreknowledge or unwittingly, right? In order to shape a new understanding, some would say a perverted, deviant sexuality of the post-war period, starting in through the 50s, late 50s is when Lolita, the literary version, G.P. Putnam, published in 58. Within a respectable number of years, within the framework of Alfred Kinsey at the University of Indiana, who first did the sexuality in the human male, then the sexuality in the human female. He did that in the late 40s. And I'm sure Nabokov, the whole country really, whether you were an intellectual or not, was really thrilled by the appearance of what we know is the Kinsey Report, right? So Nabokov publishers, this is not in alignment, this is my speculation. I think G.P. Putnam wanted to rescue that book from the porno rack and put it out under their imprint to give it a second life because of this efflorescence of gentile erotica, right? Because as we know, a lot of Professor Kinsey's research was fabricated, definitely skewed, definitely biased. Scholarship that has appeared shows that. And his archives, by the way, are still under lock and key at the University of Indiana. But he spawned a whole industry of psychiatry, psychology, the adjustment industry that we're in today in 2023. Who have replaced the rabbis? Who have replaced the priests, the imams? It's the psychotherapists, right? And those of you who are subscribers to this channel and have seen me interview people who underwent psychoanalytic training or formed cults like the Sullivanians. One of you suggested I check that book out. And so Sullivanians in the Upper West Side, I think, of New York City was a cult that helped shape abstract impressionist art in New York, through the critics, right? And it was a psychoanalytic cult, just like I would argue that the psychology mafia and the psychiatric pharmaceutical mafia today is taking us down the wrong road of anti-humanity. And we are willingly consenting to do this, right? I think we're far better off trying to look at our history analytically through true crime and crime fiction in films, or what I call cultural forensics. We're going to learn more about ourselves because we are in a society. We're going to learn more from these media, from these platforms, if you will, than we ever will from some psychotherapist who charges us by the hour, right? I want to understand the human soul. I can appreciate talking to people, paying for it if you have the money. You want to pay $200 to a total stranger to unburden yourself. And because I'm saying it's a very gendered profession, it's mostly women who used to give it away for free. You could talk to your mother or a female relative or a female friend, and she would perform that function, right? that expiation that the priest, the rabbi, the imam might have done in the past, right? And anyway, I don't want to digress from there. And I mention that because the psychotherapists were the bane of my existence at the University of California, Davis. They started hiring them at a rate far more aggressive than they were for tenured professors, tenure track professors. And that's where they are today. In fact, it got so bad that this one woman was put in the faculty offices in my department, right? And again, that's what I share with Nabokov. He saw how deadly and insidious psychoanalysis and especially psychiatry is, because it's connected. It's become wed to big pharma and so-called neuroscience. Anyway, there's all kinds of directions where you can take this, but let me stick to the main topic, and that is the idea of Nabokov being an intelligence asset, probably Central Intelligence Agency, maybe even foreign intelligence. I'm sticking with the U.S. setting right now. At first, I was going to give you some of the details of this book, but I think you should read it yourself rather than having me repeat it. Right? So I will forego an in-depth review of the book itself. It's just more of an inspiration. For example, I got acquainted with a character I didn't know about by the name of Henry Lanz, or Lanz, Lanz. He was the guy that made it possible for Nabokov to do a visiting professor gig over at Stanford University. This guy didn't leave much of a footprint intellectually. I think he wrote a book or two and some articles. But I want to find more about him. He was an American national, but he was raised overseas. I think he had some Russian influence. And this is a pattern I see scattered throughout Nabokov's acquaintances, and maybe even Nabokov himself. And that is a connection with these sort of cosmopolitan, psychoanalytic, psychiatric spies, right? From the old world coming to the US. That's this character, Lanz, right? As it turns out, he became a faculty member. It was probably Leland Stanford Jr. Okay, his name was Jr. after Leland Stanford Sr., right? The robber baron, well, he was a railroad baron, more properly, right? And his wife, Jane Stanford, who founded what was not Stanford University. It's still not Stanford University, but it's still called, formally, it's Stanford, Leland Stanford Jr., after the father, the old man, college, right? And they upgraded themselves to university status later. And I gave a talk on the occult origins of Stanford University, and the fact that the boy Junior was debuted to his colleagues in a little basket here in Sacramento, like he was going to be served up as a dinner entree. This is Leland Stanford Jr. And Jane Stanford herself, because there was a gap in age between Leland Stanford Sr. and Jane Stanford, so she outlived him, and she was able to pursue her interests in the occult religions, right? And they're still practicing occultism, but now it's called neuroscience, optogenetics. Like the disgraced president, Marc Tessier-Lavigne, who just had to step down from Stanford. He's a neuroscientist, right? That's the new cult of the moment, right? And you could trace it back historically back to Jane Stanford and the spirit cooking exercise of Leland Stanford, who was sacrificed, and he was a child. And why do I bring that up now? And look for that. My playlist is really all scattered, I think intentionally by two of you, but find out the occult origins of Stanford University. I also did one on UC Berkeley, University of California, right? So you want to check those out too. And again, that's the academic connection that I'm trying to draw here with Professor Vladimir Nabokov, who like Leland Stanford and all these capitalists and the people who were running the society back then, right? Late 19th century, early 20th century, and today, who trafficked in human beings, as well as drugs, narcotics, contraband, whiskey, you name it. But they also trafficked in animals and human beings, right? Contraband. And I think it was already a fairly robust form of illicit commerce by the time Nabokov wrote Lolita and was researching it and getting his primary insights from this guy, Henry Lanz, at Stanford University, who told Nabokov, this is in the Weinman book, by the way. That's why you have to read it for yourself. Told Weinman that on the weekends he used to go to orgies with what Nabokov would call nymphets. Right, it's very much a Lewis Carroll type of existence, out in the woods with the sprites and the fairies, Daphne du Maurier, the Bloomsburg, the nature worshippers. That's Henry Lanz, and they played. This again is the Weinman book rather. They knew each other very well, primarily over 200 games of chess. And again, I said, as I said, Lanz was responsible for getting the Nabokovs into Palo Alto. And by the way, the story about the real Lolita was kidnapped in Camden, New Jersey, 1948. This is even before I was born. And she was missing from her family for about 22 months or so, and she didn't show up. And I won't give you the circumstances because I don't want to repeat the book. She didn't show up until she called in, or someone phoned in from San Jose, California. Now, Weinman might not know this, but San Jose and is in the heart of what today we know as Silicon Valley, right? It's the major city closest to Stanford University, Palo Alto, which back then was a sleepy sort of farming type community. So that kind of tells me, well, maybe Lolita was being trafficked. Not Lolita, but Sally here. That's her real name, Sally Horner. She was abducted by some guy. This is the story, and Weinman takes it at face value. There's another possibility, and that was her own mother sold her to this guy or put her into this network because the family never talked about her being missing for years. And after she returned, they kept it a dark family secret. And Weinman misses that. Don't let that put you off from reading the book. There's still a lot of information here that's useful. So that's another hint for me that Sally Horner was part of a larger system of child abduction and trafficking across country, and she wound up in Palo Alto or San Jose, which is a hub. This whole area there is a hub for trafficking up to the present day. Right, it was by Stanford University, which already has that occultic child sacrifice origins as a institution of higher learning, as does UC, the University of California. And no doubt, I'm just talking about Californians, but no doubt this is probably true at other elite institutions on the East Coast that we all know, skull and bones are all about death. And we know about, I'm interested in what's in my own backyard and seeing how it connects to this larger system. So Professor Vladimir Nabokov found himself a professor, again, from one of these emigre types over at Cornell. And when did he teach? He taught there from 1948 to 1959. And once Lolita became a huge sensation, 58, he said, well, I don't need this anymore. And he split. Eventually, he wound up in Switzerland. I don't know if they have an extradition treaty with the United States, but after professing his love and admiration for America and American culture, he left, he got his book published, and the Weinman study deals with the struggles that he went through in order to, so I won't, bore you with the details of it, but the struggles he went through in order to put this book out, which he didn't intend as a piece of pornography. But what I'm arguing is that this is what Michael Hoffman Jr. the second might be, and I don't want to put words or thoughts into his mind, but for me, when I'm looking at Nabokov and Lolita and the phenomenon that it spawned, today we use the euphemism minor attracted children, or minor attracted adults, MAPS, or minor attracted persons, and MAPS they're called. I don't use it. This is the euphemism that is being slipped in academia. I think of revelation of the method, right? Because there's a metaphysics here that Nabokov scrupulously avoids. He taught Dostoevsky, he taught Russian literature survey, but he didn't like Dostoevsky because Dostoevsky was much involved with what's called Russian cosmism. I alluded to it, maybe I gave a talk already on Russian cosmism, which is beginning to get some scholarly and academic interest about the underlying metaphysics of, for example, Bolshevism and communism, Russian communism, Soviet communism. So that was Dostoevsky, and you can tell in his fictions, right? The brothers Karamazov, right? And all these classics that were, the Grand Inquisitor, he's a priest, right? All the books that we were taught, we needed to read, right? I wouldn't say he repudiated them, but he denigrated that legacy and wanted to pursue his own aesthetic, which is what I call the revelation of the method. And to take it even further, and I'll give you some of the reasons why I suspect this to be true, right? In a moment. Remind me if I forget. I got a very lively chat going on right now. Thank you very much. And I hope you'll share this video with friends. You don't have to read Nabokov or Dostoevsky you don't have to have any interest in literature whatsoever. The Lolita concept, it is pervasive in American culture now. And now the same people who brought you GLBTQ and women's liberation, quote unquote, which was actually women's enslavement, the same people who brought you that, which is the intelligence agencies, right? And they later got into rock and roll. They got into radio very early on, RCA, Nashville, right? Read Kathy O'Brien, Monarch, country western music eventually entered into this this nexus of trafficking that extends to this very day. There's a lot of speculation currently about Taylor Swift, right, having some sort of connection. I don't know if that's true or not, but you know what I'm talking about. It's a subterranean river that runs throughout at least the post-war history of American society and culture that Nabokov tapped into. How did he tap? Okay, that brings up to the next major point here. I'm going to try to hurry it up because I'm already taking too much time getting to the money shot, as they say in the adult business. But how did he get the tip off, right? How was the revelation of the method and the unfortunate phrase predictive programming, how did that come about? Well, I would argue it's because Nabokov either was read into or was familiar with. He doesn't talk about this in his autobiographical writing, and I don't think his biographers talk about it either. And this is my contribution, unless other people have independently stumbled upon the same connection. If so, then I defer to you, or let's share the credit equally. This is an important discovery here that I'm advancing. Remember, I stated that Professor Nabokov was at Cornell thanks to this mystery guy who got him the gig there from 1948 to 59. That's a pretty good stretch of time. And in the summers, he would go on these cross country, at least 4 of them, from coast, Cornell's upstate New York, so let's just say it's the East Coast to West Coast, right, all the way to the Intermountain West up to Utah, but definitely to San Jose, all over in his car, right, on the Great American Highway, right? Perfect for traffickers. I'm not saying he is a trafficker, but that's how they would go. And by the way, by 1910, Congress passed legislation to ban this type of trafficking. It's called the Mann Act, M-A-N-N, otherwise is known as white slavery. This is 1910, and subsequently was amended in order to reduce the number and the prevalence, not prevalence, but the reduce the incidences of these exploitation of so-called white slavery. And I guess that included teenagers or children, but primarily it was to curtail the use of prostitutions going across state, becomes an interstate crime, I guess. And one of the famous persons who befell the fate of being prosecuted under the Mann Act was Chuck Berry, right? One of the kings of rock and roll. He went to the prison for it. And another person who ran afoul, this is in the 50s now, of the Mann Act was Jerry Lee Lewis, right? Who was a minor attracted person in today's parlance. And I think it was much more prevalent than we'd like to talk about. And it wasn't just, Lolita was not a one-off. In other words, so the abduction of Sally Horner was not a one-off. In fact, there's a whole adoption trade that Hollywood stars like Joan Crawford adopted Cheryl. She became Cheryl Crane and was horribly abusive towards her. But she went to a adoption age. There's a whole story, there's books on it in literature. So she went through this process, in addition to illegal trafficking of children through quote unquote adoption agencies. The topic is much deeper than I can do justice with, here in a limited 60-minute span of time. But I'm saying that Weinman, for all the great research she's done and the women that she consults with, and I say women specifically because they own true crime and they own crime fiction. At least they like to think there. This is an outgrowth of the feminist revolution. They're all liberal feminists. A lot of them are Jewish because they have a beef with their own co-religionists, the patriarch Abraham, right? So I'm not Jewish, so don't, my father was not an Orthodox Jew like yours was, Ms. Weinman. So don't drag me into your own family and ethnic struggles that we're supposed to pay the bill on that, right? To absorb and to accept psychoanalysis and psychiatry, which Freud himself warned is too much of a Jewish representation. We got to get a goy like Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss, who was part of a Christian tradition, right? So there's religio ethnicity that's involved in these true crime writers and their sensibility. And the reason I mentioned it's not gratuitous is because their formative influence was also traced back to Cornell University, right? There was a organization called the Social Ecology Fund that in 1969 brought together all these families. A lot of them were Jewish liberal feminists who had a beef with Orthodox Judaism and were trying to separate themselves from their own patriarchal system. Good, more power to you, but don't drag me or other people, the Gentiles in academia, whoever else, and the non-believers of the Erev Rav, right, or the Canaanite corruption of Judaism. There's Judaism, and then there's the Canaanite corruption of it, which I won't get in. I've talked about it before in other presentations. They funded the 1969 Women's Conference, where a lot of these science fiction writers came, like Joanna Russ, R-U-S-S. And that's how they came to own crime fiction as well, and crime criticism and cultural criticism. and moved into academia. Now, I will grant the reality that academia was a bastion of upper middle class and bourgeois male, particularly WASP privilege, right? But that's no longer the case. It's not perfect. It's not fully representative of the entire society. Maybe it never will, but it's far better than it was back in the 1950s. But people are still talking about a 1950s situation and applying the 2020. You're in the catbird seat, Sarah Wyman, so stop whining. And I'm coming to the people you're referring to, and I'm making the effort to read these individuals and to understand society in a way that I didn't before. Okay, so in other words, the women's movement, and I'm going to post this on my Patreon. By the way, you're welcome to become members of my Patreon. Just look under Professor Hamamoto and support me month to month for these talks. This one here particularly is path-breaking. But Cornell University seems to be ground zero for a lot of these revolutionary social movements. One is the minor attracted persons one, which they had Professor Nabokov help pave the way there. And again, I don't know if he had a connection directly to the Social Ecology Fund. And just to remind you, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, later called the Human Ecology Fund, was headed by Professor, I think he was a psychiatrist by training, Professor Harold or Dr. Harold Wolff, who was at Cornell. He was at Cornell at the same time that Nabokov was a professor of literature at Cornell. And it's the same fund, which turns out to be CIA, right? There's all kinds of, look at John Marks, In Search of the Manchurian Candidate. And there's all kinds of literature on it. I don't want to waste our time here, our precious time, going through all the books. If you're a newbie, you'll have to do it on your own. But for most of my regular audience here, you're on that level. You already know what I'm referring to. The Human Ecology Fund. They funded the 1969 Women's Conference out of Cornell, where all these women came to consciousness, right, in their late 20s and 30s, and brought us to 2023, because they're writing criticism for the, like Wyman here, for the New Yorker, the New York Times, or all the art, or the journals of opinion, and they're writing criticism and publishing in the academic journals. And some of them became law professors, like Barbara Freed, right? Samuel Bankman-Fried's mama, right? Which I'm not really sure if they're biologically related. They might be. My suspicion that he's not biologically related to Sam Bankman or Barbara Freed, but that's just speculation on my part. I want to put that out there. Just think back to the earlier references I made to these, adoption agencies. And there were a lot of adoption agencies, and one of them was exploited by a psychiatrist by the name of Peter Neubauer, who I gave a talk on out of Yale. He's a psychiatrist. And he was doing twins studies, right? He get identical twins, like Dr. Mengele, right? There's a Jewish paperclip connection here. We see of paperclip and the psychiatrists as being Nazis, but there were Jewish psychiatrists who were doing the same thing as their German counterparts, but they were not Aryan. So they came to the U.S. and do these experiments, Peter Neubauer, and they would go to these Jewish adoption agencies. And there's a documentary, it's called Identical Triplets, that talks about the tragedy of these adoption agencies and Neubauer's exploitation of them, right? So I don't know if he was getting any human ecology funds, but there are a number of cross-hatching connections that I'm beginning to make here, right? And let me see if I can give you more specifics here so you can do. My real hope is for you to start investigating this on your own, or somebody who's doing research on Nabokov, because there's a Nabokov industry amongst academics and journalists, right? Just like there's a Shakespeare industry and a Dickens industry. And if I can speed or help in providing you perspective, that's all I'm hoping to do. But just to give you some empirical information here, Harold Wolff, he was at the Cornell University Medical School, not bad. Peter Neubauer. By the way, the name of the movie is Three Identical Strangers. It's relatively new, 2018. I gave a review of it. Just to show you that these cases of missing children and abductions, I don't know if you could refer to kidnapping as abduction. I'm not going to go that far, but there are certain similarities. You know, your whole life becomes a blank slate all over again, and it doesn't end well for a lot of these kids who later, grow up to be troubled adults. Okay, let me, I promised to wrap this up within an hour. Let me show you a couple of videos, first of all. Another quote unquote tell, another indication that Nabokov was playing a double multiple intelligence game is that most of you know that he was a butterfly collector, right? During the summer months from Cornell summer vacation, he would travel cross country using the American highway system, primarily used for defense, right? But also to traffic children, perhaps, like the Mann Act, interstate commerce, illegal, right? Crossing state lines for immoral purposes, right? Sally Warner was abducted in Camden, New Jersey. By the time they found her 2 years later, she was in San Jose, California, right across the country, where Nabokov had connections, right? Professional ones, maybe crypto professional, I don't know, right? So let me show you what I mean very quickly. This is taken from some archives of Nabokov as a collector. Maybe he was a collector, not of butterflies only, but of children, netting them. By the way, there's a really good novel maybe inspired by Nabokov by John Fowles called The Collector. It was later turned into a film, also excellent. It's about a guy who collected butterflies, and he abducted an adult woman this time, not a child, and held her in captivity. And that was his MO, modus operandus, right? And he was a serial kidnapper of women using butterflies as a guiding force, metaphorical and literal, to lure them into the net, so to speak. So here, very quickly, is about a 1 minute survey. Maybe I'll cut it short and move to the next phase of his being a collector, Nabokov. He's holding a butterfly. That's his wife, Vera, with a net, a specimen. Also, specimen he's carefully classifying and documenting. So you get the idea. This is all very well known. There's scholarship. There are monographs written about his fascination with a certain type of a butterfly, right? And you've all heard of Monarch, right? Monarch programming. If you haven't, just put that in your search engine. Monarch programming. I'm not going to go through it because most of my regular audience are well beyond the newbie stage. But if you're a newbie, then go ahead and look at it. Don't take my word for it. Read Kathy O'Brien. Read tons of people that talk about, independently of each other, talk about this pervasiveness of monarch butterfly programming, mind control. Oh yeah, don't prematurely tune me out just because you hear that cliche, mind control, right? Maybe Vladimir Nabokov, Professor Nabokov, was involved in what now we know as part of this larger system of control, which is still very much in place. Check out my friend and colleague, Kirby Summers, her work. She previews some of it on YouTube, but you'll have to subscribe to her Substack for long articles. It includes names very familiar with you who are into trafficking, Jeffrey Epstein being just one of them, okay? I don't have time to go through, just check out Kirby Summers' work. A lot of us have come to the same conclusions or drawing the same conclusions independently of each other, right? And that's called science. By the way, you have scientists here and there, investigators here coming to some. That's can be very compelling. I'm not saying there are not disinformation artists. Maybe Nabokov is playing that role as well, disinformation, as well as diversion and distraction, right? And very subtle. So here is a excerpt from a documentary that whimsically, lyrically, Nabokov is talking about how he became a butterfly collector and a fancier of younger girls at the same time. Here we go. There's the Great American Highway. The metaphor.
Leaving Bryceland, Loquacious Low was silent. Cold spiders of panic crawled down my back. This was an orphan. This was a lone child, an absolute waif, with whom a heavy-limbed, foul-smelling adult had had strenuous intercourse 3 times that very morning. And whether or not the realization of a lifelong dream had surpassed all expectation, it had, in a sense, overshot its mark and plunged into a nightmare. I had been careless, stupid, and ignoble, and let me be quite frank, somewhere at the bottom of that dark turmoil I felt the writhing of desire again, so monstrous was my appetite for that miserable nymphette. Mingled with the pangs of guilt was the agonizing thought that her mood might prevent me from making love to her again as soon as I found a nice country road where to park in peace.
That's one of the more memorable passages from Lolita. I think that one's read by Jeremy Irons. So you get the textures, the rhythm, the cadence of the language, the literary language. But beneath that, as Weinman properly points out, we have a horrid crime specifically committed. And I agree with her evidence, her argument holds water. Perpetrated against a real life person, Sally Horner, who didn't really grow up. She died within the 2 years of her rescue or being reunited with her family. It's a real tragedy, and I'm glad that Weinman and other researchers before her brought to light what Lolita was really about. It was really about the captivity of a life trapped like in a butterfly net. But where Weinman leaves off, I go further and say that Horner might have been trafficked as well by this career criminal who had already been convicted, I think 5 times, and spent prison time 5 times previously in abduction cases, right? Morals charges. I don't know what the specific charges were. Maybe the Mann Act. I don't know. But if anybody violated the terms of the Mann Act, it was him. He died in prison, just so you know, right, that there is some justice. And it goes into the circumstances of this capture and his background. He was not erudite. He was not literate like the narrator, Humbert, played by James Mason in the film, by the way. As portrayed by Nabokov in Lolita, he was sort of a drifter, I guess you would call them, who were in abundance back then and now, by the way. These are the people who are probably doing the trafficking, drugs, human contraband, animals, whatever they can fetch a fair price to for their exclusive clientele. So I'd like you to mull that one over and look at the book Lolita, and the Lolita concept is more than just the salacious, titillating, adolescent sort of curiosity that we all kind of brought, including myself, brought to the book initially, and look at it as a revelation of the method. Michael Hoffman second. By the way, I have a talk here posted. You'll have to search for it with the great Michael Hoffman II as part of the Professor Hamamoto series. You want to subscribe to that and you want to support me on Patreon, because I search out the cutting edge people I can, right? And Kirby Summers, many other individuals, too numerous to mention, you know, and the books to go along with it, right? I'm going to leave off here. There's a number of other points I can make here, and I might return to this topic and provide you more specifics, evidence, if you will, to support my hypothesis. But I revealed enough today, I feel, that is sufficient to start getting you to rethink this character with the butterfly net. Now I understand why, as a child, as an adolescent or pre-adolescent, why I felt he was just such a perv, you know, or just something very unclean about it. You know, I felt, you know, there was some kind of defilement going on, even beyond the pretty literary language. And a lot of people still struggle with that. Weinman says we still can appreciate him as a literary person, but I'm not sure I can go that far. Before I conclude, I knew that I was missing something. There is a body of literature that will help you understand what Monarch programming is, and importantly, help us understand the pervasiveness of it, and help to explain why today there are so many people who are experiencing problems, emotional problems. They call it trauma now. It's almost a trivial term. It's been trivialized. But one of the individuals who really helped my understanding of it, and I haven't read his recent work, but I don't think he's deviated far from his original insights, is the professional work of Dr. Colin Ross. He's an MD by profession. Let me just take you through this little video here, a short one, and I'll return to provide some concluding comments. But I set this up here so that you know that this is not something that I'm just fabricating. And if you need a doctor's prescription, or you need a doctor to provide credibility, here's one for you. It's called Dr. Colin Ross.
Life, wisdom. I'm Psyche Truth correspondent Karina Rachel, and I'm joined today by Dr. Colin Ross, an author and practicing psychiatrist based out of Dallas, Texas. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Today I would like to talk about the role of childhood trauma and how that might relate to psychological disorders later in life.
Sure.
Can you just talk a little bit? I know that you have a lot of information and research that you've done about the role of trauma and how it affects people later on in their lives. Can you just give us a little information on that?
My basic view, which is supported by a lot of research, but is not accepted by all psychiatrists, is that trauma is like the main thing going on in the mental health field, in the form of childhood physical sexual abuse, childhood neglect, family violence. And if we walk around the globe, that would include war, huge disease rates, countries where half the adult population almost is HIV positive. So really bad, serious things that are disturbing children over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. That's the main thing behind the bulk of mental health problems. And it's not just this problem or that problem or that problem, but the mental health field in general.
Very interesting. So in terms of sexual abuse and childhood trauma, one of the things that we see is that there's this recurring of the person to get themselves in abusive, situations. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, that's actually pretty easy to understand. If you've grown up in a family where everybody speaks English all the time, you end up in the pattern of speaking English. If you grow up in a family where everybody likes to hunt and fish, the odds are you're going to hunt and fish. If you've learned that your role in life is to be an object for sexual use by others and abuse, you just kind of learn that pattern and it carries on until it gets interrupted by some sort of recovery process. So it's what you're taught, it's what you believe about yourself. Also, clearly, if your father's having sex with you, there's a problem with boundaries in the family. So you don't learn healthy boundaries, how to keep people from invading your personal space. You don't have the normal coping strategies and defenses. So then there's all kinds of predators out there they sense that you're a willing victim, and they're on you. So there's many kind of factors that all lead to this pattern continuing and continuing.
Okay, we'll leave it there, and I encourage you to check out Dr. Ross's books and articles, and he's a presence on these TubeView videos, and if you want to explore it further. But it's interesting. He says that childhood trauma, and I'll use the term, and sexual abuse to a certain extent, probably, maybe to a major extent, is the source of a lot of mental health problems today. And I think that's a claim from him that what we need to take seriously, we need to at least entertain the idea that it's possible. And as a consequence, we need to create a situations in a society where it's not it's unacceptable for this type of behavior to go undetected and unpunished, right? And we're at a really low phase right now in civilization where these patterns have become normalized, especially where it has to do with childhood trauma, sex trauma. And this is the lesson years later, decades later, that Lolita can teach us, right? Nabokov, whatever his personal involvement was or non-involvement was, right? I'm not indicting him on any of these. These are speculations, these are hypothetical scenarios, right? That I'd like you to think about. This, we can still learn from this decades-long obsession with the young girls. In the book, I think she would Lolita. Her name was Dolores Hayes in the fiction. He called her Lolita. Humbert called her Lolita. She's about 12, so she's roughly very similar. Sally Horner was 11 when she was abducted, and throughout his entire life, Nabokov denied that he was influenced by the abduction of Sally Horner case, even though it was published from coast to coast, even though this was before internet. There was television, of course, but it wasn't a blanket media system we have today. He denied it because he was always being coy and disingenuous about autobiographical and IRL in real life scenarios and whether it should affect his fiction or did affect his fiction. And I think I understand why he was being coy, and it revealed very little about himself. Even his interviews, like the one with the butterfly net or the ones that he gave in supposedly more casual contexts, those were all scripted. He would not sit down with anybody unless he had his note cards presenting himself. He was managing his own persona in the guise of being an honest literary artist. Another reason for us to view him as an unreliable narrator, as it's called in literary criticism. Nonetheless, we can still learn from his own version of this lifelong fascination, minor attracted person fascination that we're seeing today. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your time. I ran a little bit over, but I'm happy that we're able to push through so much dense information, not dense information, but information that is densely packed, I say, within almost 60 minutes. But remember the main point. This is very frustrating to me when people pick up on a minor point and they miss the major point. The major point is that my guess is that Vladimir Nabokov, Professor Vladimir Nabokov, was an intelligence asset, wittingly or unwittingly. And I'll conclude there. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'll see you next week, God willing. Peace out.